I was chatting my friend from California here that I feel like I end up having to spend most of my time setting the record straight on things that are left. We'll say, I'm not going to say fake news, but I'm going to say less than accurate. So a few things to talk about. So my good friend indicated that he thought that a potential solution was to talk about how we could stop energy production off the coast of California, which is perhaps a desire of the state of California, and saying that would perhaps be an appropriate solution. I just want to make note, because I made this same comment whenever there were proposed changes off the coast of Florida under the draft proposed plan. If states are now able to exercise discretion over what happens in federal waters off their coast, that's fine. But Louisiana wants the same thing. We want to be able to decide what happens off our coast, and more importantly, what happens with the revenue stream that is derived from those activities. So my friend said that these are federal waters to be enjoyed by all Americans, but at the same time is saying that California should be able to decide what happens, and other folks have said Florida should be able to decide what happens. That's fine. But if that's the policy, then it needs to apply to Louisiana as well, where we are going to take our dollars and we are going to invest them in science-based, principled projects to improve the resiliency of our community, our ecosystem, and importantly, what every single one of you in this room should care about, helping to prevent future disaster costs and helping to ensure the sustainability of this area that has produced, as Senator Landrieu noted, perhaps around $200 billion for the United States Treasury, that in many cases, your states have benefited from more than the state of Louisiana. I also want to make note that something that distinguishes what has happened in coastal Louisiana from all of these other places, the land loss, as Mr. Barry talked about and has written about extensively, Senator Landrieu and others discussed, is the fact that the leveeing of the Mississippi River in response to the 1927 floods, the dams on the Mississippi River, these were all federal decisions that, whether we're going to argue about it was 90%, Mr. Barry, or it was 50%, it was, or I'll say 51% to make my point, it was the majority cause of land loss in the state of Louisiana. These are federal actions. Everywhere else you call that mitigation when dealing with a private sector or an individual. And in this case, the federal government is not being held to the same standard. I'm going to go ahead and stop there and yield to the gentleman from California for 5 minutes. Excuse me, Senator Dupree, as part of the state's coastal master plan, isn't the reconnection of the Mississippi River and other rivers with the coastal area part of the overall plan?
Absolutely. The most effective projects, although they are very expensive and difficult, are diversions to emulate what used to occur before the federal levees were built.
All right, so I know you're not a coastal geomorphologist, but I also know you have common sense. So if the levees were not there, and you have these canals that were dug for accessing oil and gas areas, what would happen? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, because we can compare the two deltas in Louisiana. Let's compare Plaquemine Parish, for where the Mississippi comes down to the Gulf of Mexico, where the levees go where all the fresh water and sediment goes into the Gulf of Mexico, versus St. Mary Parish at the mouth of the Atchafalaya River. Atchafalaya River and the St. Mary Parish area has a lot of oil and gas canals that were dug. Those oil and gas canals in St. Mary Parish, because you have an open river delta, are helping to distribute the fresh water, and is the largest building delta, I think, in the United States.
How about that? Thank you, Senator Dupree. Did we script that by any chance?
No.
Thank you. All
You might have.
right. No, he's on the record. He's on the record. Raise one of your hands. Thank you. Senator Landrieu, you have spent many, many years in your life talking about the disparity between Men Releasing Act. Senator Dupree just reminded us all of the story many of us in Louisiana know well about President Truman offering dollars, recognizing back then that it was a fairness issue. Could you talk a bit more about the disparity? And more importantly, the strings attached to the funding for Men Releasing Act versus GOMESA, and just talk about what Louisiana does with the money.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and members, this is so important. The interior states, we call the western land states that have a lot of federal land, enjoy a 50%, some might argue 60%, because some of that money goes to the Bureau of Land Reclamation. So it really is more than 50%. Those monies flow to those states, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming particularly. I think one year Wyoming received $1 billion. They have 600,000 people. That same year, we got 0. We have 4.5 million people slipping off into the Gulf, so that was hard to, to see those numbers. But nonetheless, those monies are unrestricted. Those monies flow to the state, the governor, the legislature. They can spend them any way they want. And if any money gets to conservation, it's just by sheer, decision. In our case, thanks to Senator Dupuy, and his leadership and yours, Congressman, and many others, our money will go by constitutional amendment only for this purpose. So even while, Mr. Chairman, our hospitals need funding, our schools need funding, our universities need funding, the people of Louisiana consider this issue so important that we ourselves have said we will restrict our funding that you give us. And we've done that with our GOMOSIP funding, our state funding, and our local funding that's generated for this purpose only. So I don't begrudge the interior states for the decisions they make about how to spend their funding, but we could use that money for hospitals and schools, believe me, and highways just like everyone else. But we're willing to take that portion and dedicate it, which I think shows our commitment to solving this problem and to being in partnership with you to do it.
Senator Dupree, I know you referenced in your testimony the constitutional amendment that you authored and worked on. Could you remind me of the percentage that passed? And just to be clear, this constitutional amendment actually, it's a state constitutional amendment that requires that every penny of these dollars go into coastal master plan, project restoration protection, and a small portion for impacted infrastructure directly impacted by OCS.
This constitutional amendment passed in all 64 parishes in Louisiana and passed by 82%, which I think to date is still the highest of the 200 or so constitutional amendments since our 1974 Constitution that has been enacted. So it's very, very high priority for the citizens of Louisiana.
Thank you. I recognize Mr. Soto for 5 minutes. Mr. Barry, I want to ask you a question. We've talked about the liability of the industry that you have discussed, I have previously discussed, Senator Landrieu has discussed. I want to focus for a minute on the liability of the federal government. Again, being a historian, you've written about this, you've pontificated on this. Do you think that the federal government should be treated differently in that they hold, if you or I were to impact wetlands, they would hold you or I to one standard, require us to mitigate for our actions, require us to address any environmental impacts, yet themselves, which I believe when you add it all up, the single largest impacts on wetlands and perhaps even the environment in the nation as a result of their actions, do you think they should be held to a different standard?
No, I mean, as you know well, we agree on much more than we disagree on. I've cited the example of the dams on the Missouri River. I mentioned the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway as a major cause of coastal land loss, and that benefits from Texas to Florida. The jetties carry what's a lot of sediment that remains in the river. Those jetties carry it 2.5 miles out into the Gulf and drop it off into deep water. That is 100% for interstate and international commerce, grain exports, and so forth.
31 states benefit from maritime commerce from the river system alone?
Yeah, Pittsburgh to Tulsa are both ports with ocean access because of that. So I certainly think that those and other reasons still are why I feel the federal government has a very appropriate role in aiding Louisiana.
Thank you. Senator Landrieu, you mentioned, and I referenced it again earlier, the $200 billion figure. Can you remind me who's paying that? Who paid that $200 billion?
That went to interior states?
But who actually paid it? Who paid?
Oh, the oil and gas industry pays leases, bonuses, and rentals, et cetera, to drill on federal land. And so that's a tax on the industry, which they pay to lease and And some of that money goes back to the reclamation fund, but a good portion of it goes to these states to spend in any way they care to spend it. Hopefully, they're spending it well, but they have no restrictions, and it's well over $200 billion. When I was in Congress, the figure I used to use is $160 billion that came from offshore, paid by the industry, and then onshore, it's over 200.
So I just wanted to reiterate the point that there is money now. It is being paid. Our concern is, I think, largely how those funds are being allocated. And we were playing with some back-of-the-envelope numbers, and if I remember this correctly, from 2006 to last year, the amount of revenue sharing that the Gulf states have received was less than 0.5%. Is from the revenue that was actually produced versus the revenue that was shared with the states, less than 0.5%. And for the offshore states, for onshore, as you've mentioned, it's approximately 50%, or in the case of Alaska, 90%. So much disparity. Mr. Chassaw, Senator Dupree mentioned the fact that in Terrebonne Parish alone, you have over 70% of the land is owned by private companies, just 2 companies. If I recall correctly, 82% of coastal Louisiana is owned by private companies. And those companies, in the far majority of cases, are oil and gas companies, energy companies. Can you talk about, we just did one of the largest restoration projects in Louisiana history, just near your port, south of your port. Can you talk about the role that those private landowners play in those restoration projects?
Absolutely. The private landowners are very supportive of the restoration work that's taking place. As Congressman Graves just mentioned, over $200 million was just spent on recreating and renourishing the Caminada Headlands project, which protects Port Fourchon. As Senator Dupree mentioned, ConocoPhillips is also a major landowner in the area of Port Fourchon, as well as other private landowners, and they're very supportive of all the action that is taking place in and around the coast. Because we're building, as I said in my testimony, we're building in a smart, resilient way. When we do something on the landscape to develop industrial facilities, we're actually doing just as much outside of that landscape to recreate some of the marshes that has been lost throughout the last several years.
And very quickly, so if you have 82% of the land in private hands, the majority of that is oil and gas companies, would it be fair to say that the energy companies actually are disproportionately impacted and their infrastructure is disproportionately impacted by land loss because their infrastructure is not designed to be exposed to open water? I mean, is that fair? Meaning that
Absolutely.
They would have a disincentive to promote erosion.
That's absolutely correct.
Thank you. I yield to Mr. Lowenthal.
One of the others. Mr. Barry, Louisiana's oil and gas industry said they'd be willing to collaborate with the state to solve the problem of land loss if your lawsuit wasn't in the way. Since the lawsuit's dismissal in 2015, has Louisiana's oil and gas industry returned to the table to try to work out an agreement to financially support coastal restoration efforts?
No. And in fact, there's a group of parish presidents that meet, and the industry, Chris John, former congressman, represents Louisiana Mid-Continent, told John Young, the president of that group, come talk to him after the lawsuit was taken care of, and they talk about working something out. John Young said never heard from them afterwards. The governor, Governor Edwards, soon after he took office, wanted a private meeting with the people the companies that had done the most damage to see if they could work out some kind of voluntary agreement. And they simply refused to even discuss with the governor the possibility of any kind of agreement. The whole point of the litigation which the levy board brought was to try to create a new conversation. I think it's important to note there have been 2 different polls. The first one I didn't believe, but it was confirmed by one 18 months later, that said over 90% of likely Louisiana voters thought the oil and gas industry should participate in contributing to the solution. 18% of likely Louisiana voters thought only the oil and gas industry should pay, which is not a position that I share. So as Congressman Graves said, the government should be held to the standard. If you contribute to the problem, you should contribute to the solution. So should the industry.
Thank you. Mr. Chason, at a meeting of the Lafourche Parish Council in 2016, you argued against the parish filing a lawsuit against the oil and gas companies for wetland damages. Referring to Cameron Parish, which did file a lawsuit, you said, and I quote, "I can tell you right now, our customers are not going to Cameron." The majority's memo, though, for this hearing, however, states that $30 billion of natural gas export infrastructure in Cameron is now under construction. It doesn't seem like customers are avoiding Cameron, so that's what you said. I want to go to Mr. Barry. Do you believe that the state of Louisiana or individual parishes should worry about companies leaving or not investing because of coastal damage lawsuits?
No, for us, this is over past damage. So if they leave, they don't escape any liability. The head of one of the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association for years had said if you sue the industry, that people are going to leave. In a deposition under oath, he could not name a single company, not one, that had even considered the legal climate in Louisiana in making a decision whether to operate in the state.
Again, Mr. Barry, many of the defenses of the industry center on the idea that they had valid permits to construct these canals, so therefore they can't be held responsible for the damages that they cause. Do you think that's a valid argument?
Every permit included boilerplate language saying that the permit does not exempt them from liability, doesn't give them any immunity. If you have a neighbor who gets a permit to build a ditch on his property, and that ditch causes your house to collapse, the fact that he had a construction permit does not mean that he escapes liability for the damage to your house.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Chasson, as Executive Director of the Greater Lafourche Port Commission, are you concerned that your port and the extensive associated oil and gas transmission and storage system are at risk due to land subsidence and exposure to stronger storm surges?
Yes, I do.
What is the best way to combat that? I mean, in other words, I know there's a lot of efforts going on for conservation and rebuilding and fixing the coastline, but what is the best thing that could happen in terms of those efforts, those ongoing efforts?
The things that are currently taking place, which is rebuilding the coastline with that Caminada Headlands project that took place, first line of defense, rebuilding the marsh apron around all of these areas like the port, utilizing the material that is dredged in and around navigation channels for the best use and beneficially use all of that material, unlike a lot of what takes place in the Mississippi River.
Mr. Dupree, how does the CPRA strategize and prioritize projects as it develops the master plan? And in your opinion, which projects are the most effective at restoring land?
Projects are developed according to science and sustainability, cost, obviously. There are two types of restoration projects, offensive and defensive. The best, most effective projects is what emulates what the Mississippi River used to do, diversions off the river. But geographically, some of us don't have the luxury of living next to the Mississippi River. In my home parish, A diversion from the river would be obscenely expensive with all the infrastructure to have to relocate in the population. So sometimes because of geography and where we live, we have to rely on defensive projects, as Mr. Chasson described, like Barrier Island projects, marsh creation, levees, Gulf levees to protect from tidal waters, rather because or having to be built higher and bigger because of the river levees built in the early 20th century.
And do you think that the 2017 CPRA master plans projects will be effective in restoring the coast? I mean, I guess either of you could answer that, or maybe both. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do. The master plan is based on good, sound science, and they've been doing a really good job at putting together projects that are going to benefit the coast. That's what it's there for. And
Can I add something to that, if I
Sure, Senator.
could? I just want to restate to this committee how extraordinary it is that a master plan was even created. I mean, in this time of political blame game and back and forth and people standing in their own corners, our master plan has passed almost unanimously, and our legislature, Mr. Congressman, has been unanimous. And that's very difficult to get not just the politics aligned, the parishes aligned, the priorities aligned, and we don't get enough credit for that. And if I could just add one thing, and Reggie, thank you for saying this, but Mr. Lowenthal and Mr. Graves, asking Lafourche and Terrebonne Parish to sue the oil and gas industry would be like asking Florida to sue the cruise line industry, asking Las Vegas to sue the casino industry, asking New York City to sue the finance industry. It is really an unfair inference. It infers that the people of Lafourche and Terrebonne don't care about their hunting, their wetlands, their fishing. We hunt, we fish, we canoe, kayak, and get in our pirogues more than anybody in this country, and we value our environment. The question is not about, in this committee, what oil and gas is doing. The question is, what is the federal government doing?
Thank you.
To share these revenues, fairly.
You're a very effective advocate for this, and I so appreciate you, Senator, reiterating that. I've got about 35 seconds left, and I may be the last, I guess, in this hearing. One parting shot from any of you that want to do that. As a freshman member of Congress, I find it difficult sometimes to explain to my friends from high and dry lands in other parts of the country what it would mean if the land and communities in southern Louisiana disappear. In your 15-second elevator speech, how do you summarize that, the urgency of this and what it would mean to us?
it's critically urgent. We grew up on the land. I grew up in those pipeline canals that were dug back in the marsh. Restoring this, maintaining it is critically important to our way of life and our culture.
It means that your district becomes the coast in the next 150 years. That's what happens.
And that is in Shreveport, okay, for most people.
Well, the reality is the cost of the rest of the nation would skyrocket. Gasoline prices went up enormously. I forgot the exact number, but I think it was over $1 a gallon right after Katrina. The grain exports, 60% of the grain, commercial fisheries, and all, and the panel here is unanimous, I'm sure, on the damage to the national economy.
But what an excellent opportunity, my elevator speech, for this committee, Natural Resources Committee, to take one of the greatest natural resources combined in the coastal places of our nation, whether it's the California resources, the Florida resources, Louisiana, and come up with a policy. Keep us out of the courtroom. Find justice for people. Come up with a plan. Help us to help ourselves save this coast.
Thank you all.
Thank you. I'm gonna babble a little bit, and certainly love to hear your babbling too. Can't wait.
It's the last babble.
It is, all right. Well, okay, so I want to note a few things. If you mind throwing that graphic up if you can. I know this is hard to see, but this basically shows just the incredible disparity. If you look in the bottom right, I threw out a number earlier, and I said something about less than 1/2 of 1%. This is, as I recall, I think this was 2006 to 2017, the tall bar in that bottom right box. It shows that approximately $67 billion in revenue in the offshore was brought into the U.S. Treasury just from the Central Gulf. In return, the states in the Central Gulf collectively received $33 million. $33 million. Senator Landrieu, as you have said over and over again, if this were produced onshore, those states would have shared, if it's $67 billion, then they would have shared somewhere around $33.5 billion. $33.5 billion, not $33 million. Just giving you an idea of the disparity and how things are treated. Mr. Soto mentioned the impacts from oil spills. Well, you know what Cuba's producing, which is perhaps even closer to the state of Florida. I'm not sure if they're getting a revenue stream from there. Mr. Barry, you mentioned the national implications. Gasoline prices went up, they spiked 75 cents a gallon after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. They spiked $1.40 a gallon after Hurricanes Gustav and Ike, just indicating the national importance of this region and this issue. Senator Dupree, the levee districts. The levee districts that are in charge of protecting and sustaining our communities all over the state of Louisiana, with the exception of one, the one that filed the lawsuit. Every single other one in the state of Louisiana opposed the lawsuits against the oil and gas industry, recognizing that partnership. That, look, I understand up here people may not get and understand, but lastly, look, there are other really important projects around the country, and I'll think of Florida Everglades, California Bay Delta, Salton Sea, whatever project you want to throw out there. There are a lot of other federal priorities that are out there. And I want to read you a line from and you know what? We come up with funding for them. We prioritize them and we come up with funding. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year. I love my friends from Florida, and I've given 2 speeches to the Everglades group. This is a 2004 National Geographic article. Louisiana has the hardest working wetlands in America, a watery world of bayous, marshes, and barrier islands that either produces or transports more than 1/3 of the nation's oil and 1/4 of its natural gas, and ranks only second to Alaska in commercial fishing landings. I want to make note, that's by weight, and it's because of the shells of the king crabs. I don't think it's fair. But as wildlife habitat, it makes Florida Everglades look like a petting zoo by comparison. Ouch. I'm reading National Geographic. Of course, I wouldn't say that. But look, here's my point. When we recognize that something's nationally important, like the Everglades, like Chesapeake Bay, like California Bay Delta, whatever it is, if we recognize something is nationally important, you know what? We find the resources to do it. And Senator Landrieu, you and I have discussed at length the fact that, look, as important as we all know Louisiana is, obviously to our state and to our nation, in many cases, Florida, because of its population and political importance, California, because of its population and political importance, Great Lakes, the one I left out, over $1 billion in restoration for the Great Lakes because of the political importance. All these projects, Louisiana is not getting the same treatment. And it's not because of the national importance. I think it more so has to do with political importance. And the reality is if you look at true metrics, this is one of the most important investments in the nation. I think we're the canary in the coal mine with regard to sea rise and subsidence challenges. And if we don't get it right policy-wise, legally, engineering and otherwise, if we don't get it right in Louisiana, what in the world are the rest of the states going to do whenever they experience some of the similar challenges that we are? We've got to get it right. This is the laboratory. It's the canary in the coal mine. And whether we use offshore energy revenues, which I think is a very good fit, and I think it's parity with policies for the onshore, or we choose other revenue streams, we cannot allow this trajectory to continue. So, thank you. If anybody wants to rebut or anything else, Congressman Johnson, Congressman Lowenthal, you got. All right. All right. He just said he agrees with everything I said. All right.